toss and tumble on a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blues.
Well, I'm thrilled to have Sarah Dove here joining us today. And she's going, Sarah, I mean, you're going to tell us a little bit about what you do and your background, but essentially, we're going to talk a little bit about children's mental health and how that might have been affected by the pandemic. But can you just start, for those that don't know you, Sarah, tell us a little bit about your day job, what you get up to.
So, in terms of my day job, I've been working with children who are vulnerable to exclusion for the last 18, 19 years. And when I talk about exclusion, I mean children that might be permanently excluded. They might have difficulties in their social situations or their family situations, but also children that might be excluded because of their medical needs that make it difficult for them to attend school. That could be things like life-limiting, life-threatening conditions such as cancer, or equally, it could be things like psychiatric needs such as anxiety, depression, psychosis, and so on.
Right, so
And in terms of what I do every day, it's quite varied. So I do a lot of work with local authorities about how to promote inclusion within their schools.
Right, and am I right in thinking, Sarah, you also do some work with within alternative provision sites?
So I am the president of the national organisation PRUSAP, which represents PRUs and APs nationally. But I also do direct work with pupil referral units and AP. So things around looking at behaviour, looking at the systems, how to improve the experiences for teachers and the young people to make sure it's a safe place. But my bread and butter work before I was made redundant and became a consultant was teaching in pupil referral units and being a head teacher in a PRU.
Right. So it would be fair to say quite a lot of experience with children at the margins of education. And, you know, that being the case, I know that one of the things that you've been doing over recent months is doing a mental health chat. Can you tell us a little bit about that work?
Yeah, so as there was increasing lockdowns across Britain, we became more aware that children were struggling with the ill effects of lockdown, essentially. So the change in routines for some children, for some they might have been experiencing domestic violence, for others it might have been a concern and fear about returning to school. We wanted to do something practical to help children, but also parents and education practitioners as well. So we started a Kids COVID mental health chat. It's quite well attended by clinicians, teachers, sometimes children themselves and parents. And really we explored different issues around children's mental health relating to COVID. So some of that has been around the return to school, about establishing routines for that children. For some, it's because actually they have already have mental health difficulties and it's been either exacerbated by COVID in terms of isolation, or alternatively, actually, they've had bigger barriers in returning to school. And how is that managed? And that's a great conversation that we have. And it's just on Twitter. It's very informal and we pose different questions and we share practice, essentially.
And what's the hashtag for that, Sarah?
It's Kids COVID MH.
Kids COVID MH. And is it Tuesday night?
It's a Tuesday night between 8 and 9 p.m.
Right. So if you want to join in with Kids COVID MH, mental health chat, tune in to Twitter at that time and take part in that conversation. So, Sarah, so one of the things which I happen to know is that you've got a book that's going to be released next year, and on managing behaviour in the classroom. Can you tell us a little bit about your book and the sorts of messages that you put forward in it?
Yeah, no problem. So I'm just going to sort of correct a little bit around managing behaviour. It's more around understanding behaviour and not just about noticing it, but looking at real strategies to support children's engagement in class and around the school. So we look at a wide range of different issues and we have what's called an XY axis. So for example, rather than just saying a child has poor behaviour. What we look at is more of, is that behaviour consistently poor, and what does that poor mean? What do we notice? What do we see? And could there be underlying issues relating to that? We want to move away from this idea that all behaviour is communication. Yes, of course it is. Children are telling us something by the way that they behave. But how do we provide real strategies for those children? And throughout the book, there's a series of, I call them case studies, but actually it's children's stories of children that I've worked with. So I've had the joy of working in psychiatric inpatient services and hospital schools, as well as mainstream and alternative provision. And it's children that have kind of showcased some of their difficulties and how we might support those children. But whilst it's looking at nurturing behaviours that we want to see in the classroom and how we might understand them better, there's also a chapter around teachers' mental health. And actually, when things are really difficult and things don't go as planned, how can we support ourselves as well? And that comes from my own lived experience of I attempted to kill myself. This is a bit dark, really, isn't it? 4 years ago. And it talks a little bit about that and how your mental health is incredibly important as well as young people.
Right. So the real sort of in the trenches feel, both for someone who has struggled with your own mental health and from the perspective of working with children. What would you say your book has to offer for teachers working in comprehensive schools, not mainstream schools? What will they get from reading it?
So the children that I talk about have existed and do exist within mainstream schools. So it's children that might have come through their exclusion, as well as children that I've met within mainstream. And the idea is that they can pick out different things and try and think about things differently. One of the most powerful things that I had someone say to me is you can get really stuck around a child's behaviour. It becomes incredibly frustrating if children aren't responding in the way that you would like. So what I hope that this book offers is a way of thinking differently about things that we may have got stuck and got into a routine of trying to deal with it on our own, but actually seeing the child as part of a wider system within the school culture, within the system of parents, family, and the community. And I would say these children, whilst at the margins of education, actually children are part of our community and they are all our responsibility.
Right. Okay. So I'm interested in one of the things that you said there, and obviously I haven't read the book yet; it's not out yet. I'm looking forward to having a crack at it. But you said there you're trying to move away from the idea that behaviour is communication. Why do you think that's not a particularly helpful message?
I think it's become a cliche, which tells us very little about the child, and very little about their story. So,
Right.
and I think any broad brush response means that we aren't really understanding the child. And I think it's that, yes, behaviour is communication. I'm not saying it's not, but it's also part of a system. It's not just a child expressing their thoughts and feelings. It's also an expression of the society they're in, the system they're in, the culture they're in, and so on. And I just think when you say that, I think there's always the worry that it reduces it to not having to deal with it. Oh, they're just trying to tell us they're upset, or they're just trying to tell us there is trauma, or just that. And then we ignore it and don't look at ways of supporting that child to be able to express their needs in a different way. And I think always with cliches, whether or not the cliche is zero tolerance or a restorative practice or whatever it might be, that when we have a catch-all phrase and situation, I think it does little to really unpick some of the difficulties that child has, or that school might have, or that family might have, because I don't want to problematize the child either. I think the child is often has a whole range of different things happening around them.
Right. I mean, it struck me always as something which is true but trivial. It kind of means to anybody whatever they want it to mean. Another thing, we were having a bit of a chat about your views on behaviour before we started the interview, and something which may surprise some viewers is that you said you'd attended some of Tom Bennett's training, and you found that actually you pretty much agree with a great deal of Tom's message on behaviour.
Yeah, so I think it was, oh my goodness, it feels like a lifetime ago now. We're in a pandemic. I think it was last year. Yeah, it does. Tom might correct me. Tom was kind enough to, I don't think he invited me. I think I might have invited myself because I'm bolshy like that.
Like you.
Yeah, it does sound like me, doesn't it? And there was lots around the culture of a school that is really important. And the other idea about, oh, they behave well for me. And I don't want to take away issues around a relationship with a child. I was probably a naughty kid at school and probably didn't do the right thing by teachers. I'm sorry. But it excuses behaviour. And I don't think we should excuse behaviour. And I think Tom's idea around a culture and the culture of a classroom, I think that's really important. I think there's certain phrases that I would use singing around a pupil referral unit, right place, right time, and everyone would be saying the same things, and there'd be the same high expectations about actually you're not in the right place at the right time. So in that regard, I don't think Tom said anything particularly controversial in that training. I mean, he might say crazy stuff in other training, I'm sure, but certainly not the one that I was in.
No.
And I think that culture is really important. I would go further and say that culture has to include ensuring that children feel like they belong to that system. So when there's a culture and children don't feel like they belong within it, that can be quite difficult. And I don't think it's any surprise that I'm not a fan of, for example, booths or internal exclusions, because I think that kind of moves that child out of the culture of the school, and I'd rather bring them in. Now, that can be really difficult, and I understand that. But for me, I think because I've worked with children in the margins, what I'm interested in is how do we bring them in to make sure they feel they belong, whilst also being very clear about what the boundaries are in terms of acceptable behaviour.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I was one of the head teacher, one of the schools that I'm currently working with. We were having a chat about something similar to that, and he said he really hates the term exclusion because, in his view, the children who are temporarily not in their normal lessons are far from excluded. There's a big team working around them to support their return back into lessons and to make that as seamless and as trouble-free for everyone involved as possible. And I think that there's lots of, like, as always with these sorts of discussions, there tends to be more heat than light through sort of probably unhelpful use of rhetoric. But I think that one of the things that's always struck me, and I don't know what your view is on this, Sarah, and you might correct me, is that in order for the mainstream school system to be successful, for it to provide the education that it does for the majority of children, it needs excellent alternative provision. Do you think that's a fair point?
I think so. One of the things that people might not know is that I'm currently doing a PhD, which is exploring young people's experience of AP.
Right.
And again, it comes to this idea of belonging. So some of those children didn't feel like they belonged within mainstream school. Now, that was for lots of different reasons. Some was around relationship. Some was about the size of mainstream schools. I think my concern around mainstream schools is that there's often a narrowing of the curriculum. And things like league tables means that there's more importance put on some subjects than others. And actually, not all children are going to be fantastic at a certain subject. And that's not the end of the world. I think when we restrict our curriculum offer, then even more children are going to be on the margins. Now, do I think that excellent alternative provision should be available? Yes. Would I rather that children didn't have to be excluded to access it? Absolutely, because I think permanent exclusion in itself is really difficult for young people to be told, actually, your behaviour is so difficult, so disruptive, or whatever it might be, that we don't want you part of this school community. What I would rather see is AP as part of a continuum of support for children. But I also know, and I wrote an article for Schools Week a couple of years ago now. But for some children, starting to attend an alternative provision can be a space where they feel like they belong. But what I wouldn't want is to kind of advocate a position where we say, actually, for children to feel like they belong, we have to exclude them first. I think that's a really uncomfortable position to be in. So for me, there's issues around choice and diversity of curriculum offer. But also, you mentioned the school that you're working with at the moment about support in terms of a smaller nurture base almost, where actually they can develop those relationships with teachers, develop some of those skill sets, but also things like the therapy dogs, the nurture support, and so on, but also developing really close relationships with parents and carers, because actually we know that for some children, their parents may have had really poor experiences of school and they may have had fairly low aspirations. So I know from my own family situation, I'm the first person in my family to finish school successfully. So let alone getting an A level or doing a degree, but really getting GCSEs and not leaving school. Now, my mum found it really difficult to go to parents' evenings and things like that because there wasn't that framework for her. So that was really hard. And it was a surprise that I finished school successfully, I think would be fair to say. And I think we need to be mindful that children their parents may have had really poor experience of school. So how do we support them to have a better relationship with school and build their self-esteem as well as the children's?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and obviously it's something that individual teachers, it's probably outside of something they can really get to grips with. But for schools, doing this as from a whole school perspective, what are the sorts of things that you would advise to try and bridge that gap between parents that feel alienated by their own educational experiences?
I think it starts before you even step through the door. So a lot of parents will find out about the school through websites. So making sure they're accessible, easy to use, and that there's a contact for them to ask questions. But as well, I have the joy of seeing lots of different schools throughout the country, and there is a difference between a grumpy receptionist being quite grumpy, I don't know how else to put it, compared to a member of staff at the front going, "Hey, come in, hello, lovely to see you." That doesn't cost anything different in money, but the response and approach in engaging children, you belong to our school community, we want you in, hello, can make a really powerful difference. I think as well, there's bits around, I mean, I don't want to get too entrenched in conversations around school uniform, but things like making sure school uniform is financially accessible, that parents are listened to as well. So I often talk about a belief in the experience. So often you might hear teachers say to parents, but so-and-so is fine at school. And that's when a parent has come and said, like, things are really difficult. And then the teacher's response is, but they're fine at school. And I've said it myself as well, so I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It negates the experience of the parent having real difficulties, and they've come and they've opened up. And again, that's about those careful conversations. Now, primary schools do it really well because you've got your family liaison officer who engages on that, and they're on the school gate. I think if there was an approach in which those vulnerable parents and families could have those conversations as well, and I think respecting parents and respecting their expertise. And I think that's what's really good about the Kids COVID mental health chat, that it's not reliant on clinicians or teachers, but also about parents' experiences. And parents often, especially children with special needs, they might have gone to lots of meetings where they talk about the same thing. But actually, their expertise as a mum or a dad is not particularly respected. And how do we make sure that it is within the context of meetings, but then actually how is that enacted within practice with that child? So I think it's complicated, and I probably haven't answered your question.
I think you have. No, and I think there's some really interesting things. You know, that school uniforms are really interesting one. I think some of the best schools I've worked with, they might have a strict uniform, but they'll say, look, if you can't get a uniform, we'll buy it for you. Here it is, the uniform room in school, and if you're struggling with anything, just let us know and we'll give you whatever you need. rather than making it a barrier. And it's approaches like that can make the real difference. One of the things, and this is something, it's just like a personal bête noire for me, and I thought maybe I'd ask you about it whilst I'm here, is that all the time, one of the themes that seems to be really consistent in reporting on schools and the media is that there seems to be a common pattern where a school has really, really struggled. Perhaps it's gone into special measures. It's been brokered into a trust. The trust has come along and tried to raise standards, and they put in strict policies in order to make that possible for learning to happen. There's a disgruntled parent who gets in touch with the newspaper, and all of a sudden it's a story about how horrible the school is. And it always strikes me as, why don't newspapers, for instance, why don't parents get in touch with schools and go, gosh, some of these places are chaotic and it's really horrible for my child to be there. Why do we always report on schools, negatively on schools that are trying to make a calmer, more orderly environment? What's your take on that?
I think it goes back to the idea that you're more likely to complain than you are to offer compliments, aren't you? I don't think it's any different from school or otherwise. I take it from the starting point that as a parent, my job is to represent my child.
Yeah.
So I always, when I get disgruntled parents, I have a lot of disgruntled parents, but my view is that's their job. Their job is to protect their child. And if they're doing that in whatever means they think's helpful, then that's great. But then I suppose you need to look at the school as being part of the community and what has become problematic for them to make sure that all children and all parents' voices feel valued. And there's also the aspect of some children don't respond very well to blanket rules, for example, because so if I were to give my daughter as an example, and it's one that Tom uses as well. So I've got Tourette syndrome, and my daughter, she started to tick and make lots of noises. She's really loud. And there's blanket rules around talking, for example, in her school. In class at certain things, and she takes that blanket rule because she's very literal, as if I tick or make a noise, then I'm going to get in trouble. Now, then there's the bit of, or actually, you need to speak to your teachers, you need to explain, and they will be absolutely fine. And of course, they're absolutely fine. But how people internalize those rules and understand them may be different to someone else. So my daughter catastrophizes. Other children would go, well, clearly I've got Tourette's or I've got tics and the teacher's not going to mind. Or, I've broken my foot and I have to wear trainers, but I've got a note from my mum and it's all right. But some people don't internalize rules in that way, and they panic and they get worried about what it means for them. Or, no mobile phones, but a child's diabetes blood sugar is on their mobile phone on an app. Now, again, a school is generally going to be responsive to that. But sometimes if people aren't confident about having those conversations, or when they do open up those conversations, it's not met with a sensible approach, then I think that can be difficult.
No, that's a really interesting point. Not something I'd thought about before. That the way we communicate the rules of a school to the individuals who are perhaps going to be most affected by them needs to be perhaps thought through more. If it were the case that that wasn't that happening in a school, then clearly there's a mistake being made there. But I hadn't really thought about it from the perspective of either a child or a parent that didn't feel able to say, what about me? What about my access? And that's really a really good point.
And I think as well, if you already feel different and you already feel vulnerable for whatever reason, so my daughter feels vulnerable for making noises, and then she has to express her difference, then it pushes you out into those margins. And people might say, well, it's really obvious that she's ticking. Of course, we're not going to tell her off. But as I said, how the child or parent might internalize it, and especially if you're a type of child who doesn't want to break the rules, that can be really difficult. And it's those quiet voices that I worry about as well.
Yes, no, me too. Exactly right. I think they're the easiest to overlook, and the ones that you know, I personally, maybe unfairly, I feel most compassionate towards. Sarah, thanks so much for talking to us. If you had to sort of distill all of your expertise into one really pithy sentence that teachers could take away and sort of and apply to their various contexts, what would you say is the cardinal thing that teachers should be conscious of?
Believing in children's experience.
Right. Sarah Dove, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and it's been your time we've been wasting. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Stay behind, you can run